Hey, you know, I was thinking this week, it's funny how car companies, and this comes from a guy whose last name is Ford, how car companies try to get us, like, especially men, thinking about the car as like, you know, a Star Wars vehicle, like a voyage. You're getting ready to go somewhere. You need something. I was thinking about that. Listen to these car names. Explorer, right? I would buy an Explorer. Expedition. We're on an expedition. Pathfinder. Yeah, that's like male stuff all over it. Voyager. Quest. We're on a quest. Forerunner. Trailblazer. We'd have a car, Trailblazer. Conquest. Prius. I just threw that in for Dan. You know, when I was growing up in the family, our car, it was a Rambler. You know, we rambled to the grocery, then we rambled back home, and then we rambled over to the school, then church. And then when we would go on a long trip, my father faced the same question that every father here faces. We hear this one question repeated every 10 minutes or more, and that question is this: are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I know that some parents, you know, they say things like this. They kind of lie to their kids. They say, not yet, Johnny, but we're almost there. Or something, you know, that would sort of keep them hanging on, sort of break up that long time into little increments that they can manage. Jay told me this week that the standard response from his grandmother at that question was, a little less than half an hour, right? They could be going from New Jersey to Florida, just started, a little less than a half an hour. I really believe you should level with kids and say what I said. I said, are you kidding? We ain't even close. Jordan, you're going to have a beard by the time we get there. And if you keep asking, it only makes it longer. And that's why my kids are now in therapy. Are we there yet is really a part of the human condition. It's not just asked on trips, but really it's asked on every aspect of our lives, even our spiritual lives. And I was thinking possibly the first time the question was ever asked was in the book of Exodus. You remember? Israel was in Egypt. They had been there for 400 years as slaves. They were an oppressed people. And then all of a sudden, God came and he says to Moses, Exodus 3:7, I have indeed seen the mystery or the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. And I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to take them, to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And by the way, that text is loaded for Old Testament scholars, because it basically says what no other God has said. God sees, God cares, God acts. But look at that, verse 8, he says, I have come to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians. How? I'm going to take them out of Egypt into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's an Israelite way of saying it's great. In other words, he says, we're going on a trip. And it's a simple trip. We're going out of Egypt, and we're going to go to the promised land. We're going to go from slaves to the place of milk and honey. And it shouldn't take long. It really isn't. It's not a long trip. I know you saw the movie with Charlton Heston, but it's not a long trip. If you just take a very famous trade route from where they were to the Canaanites, to where Canaan is, you just get on I-85 North and you're there. Really, it only takes 4 to maybe 6 weeks tops. And that's what it is. Look at this map. I want to show you something. I hope you can see this. Yeah. On this map, this is where they are. You don't see that because, oh man, the battery died. Do we have a ladder? All right, you're going to have to do this. If you go all the way up to that very tip where you see the sea, all right, at the very tip where all the traffic is. If you go on that road that goes right along the coast, if you go straight up that coast, that is the most direct route. And it's not like it's like a major thoroughfare. It's a trade route. Everyone knew about that route. It goes right through where the Philistines live, and it's right into the new promised land. But they don't go that direction. They go south. You see the purple little arrow? It comes down into, and that is a desert area. Now, again, God doesn't take them on I-85 North, the direct route. He takes them I-85 South toward the wilderness. Now, by the way, when we hear the word wilderness, I often think of like interior Canada, a bunch of trees, the lake, just nothing around, bears. And that's the wilderness. We think of it as the outside, in the west, maybe near the Colorado Rockies and all that stuff. When you hear the word wilderness in the Bible, which is arid land, it means desert. Now, you have to imagine how disorienting this would be because the Israelites knew. There's this pillar. Remember how God led them? There was this pillar that was in front of them. The text says it was a pillar of cloud that led them by the day, and it was a pillar of fire that led them by night. I mean, think of this. This is God leading them. So tangible. This is like the ultimate Waze navigation. The pillar then, it starts to move. But immediately they notice, oh, we're going the wrong way. We're not going along the coast. We're going down. We're going south, the opposite way. We're going into the desert. And so it's a really good test for them. And maybe it's a good test for you and me. The question is this: will people follow God when they don't understand what He's doing? Will they follow Him when it seems like everything's in the wrong direction? Will they stay faithful during the detours of life? See, this is a part of my problem, and maybe your problem. And it's one of God's most irritating qualities. We're in a hurry. God's not. And by the way, this is not some minor detour. That little going south, 4 weeks turned into 40 years. By the way, 40 is a significant number. It has special significance in the Bible, right? I mean, if you just go through it. Have you ever noticed how many times 40 appears? Isaac and Esau both got married when they were 40 years of age. I tried to follow that biblically myself. 40 days marked the time of the flood. 40 days marked the time when Moses was up in Mount Sinai getting the 10 Commandments. 40 days was the period where Jesus was resurrected and then he ascends to heaven. King David reigned 40 years. His son, Solomon, reigned 40 years. So let me tell you this. 40 is often used in the Bible, not in a literal way, but a symbolic way to refer to, whenever you hear the word 40, it means it was a lengthy and significant period of time. Think of that. So, biblically speaking, I'm more or less 40 years old. Now, don't come up and say, well, Dwight doesn't believe in the literal Bible. No, the number 40 doesn't mean what Western culture thinks it means with our IBM mentality or balancing our checkbook. The numbers got to... Numbers always have significance in the Bible. For example, whenever you see the number 7, it always means whole. It means complete. Could mean perfect. The number 12 almost always refers to the covenant with Israel. 12 tribes, 12 disciples. When Jesus was feeding the 5,000, and they were all Jews, and by the way, it just says 5,000 men. They had their wives, maybe some kids, so it was a lot more than just 5,000. Remember, he feeds them, but how many doggy bags were left over? Right? 12. And what the writer is saying is that all of Israel would be fed by the manna from the Messiah, right? And then, by the way, he does the same miracle, that's why you often get them confused, on the other side of the tracks. He goes across the sea, across the Sea of Galilee, and goes into Decapolis. Decapolis was a Gentile place. It's where all the Gentiles, it was the bad place. All the Jews on this side thought, that's pagan, that's them people over there. And it was, Jesus referred to that area, and the Jews referred to that area. It's in Acts. It says they were the 7 nations of Canaan. 7. So in other words, when the Israelites came in, kicked out the Canaanites, they went that direction, and so they were the 7 nations. Now, here's the deal. When Jesus fed the 5,000, the Jews, how many leftover bags? 12. When he goes and feeds the 7 nations of Canaan, how many take-home sacks? 7. In other words, Messiah will bring spiritual manna not only to Israel, but to the whole world. He's the bread of life. Our little Christmas story, for I have good news for all people. So 40, think of it meaning a significant time or significant period. How long did it rain on Noah? 40 days and 40 nights. Now, obviously 40 nights. What's the deal? It's just saying it was a long period. 40 is especially crucial when it comes to the desert. When Moses, you remember, he killed the Egyptian, and he runs into the Midian desert, and he lives there for 40 years. When Elijah is terrified by Queen Jezebel, and he's running for his life, he runs into the desert, and he's there for 40 days. After Jesus, after he was baptized, you may think now, like, I want to do the I-85 to glory and ministry. But there's a detour. In fact, Mark says he is driven. Jesus was driven. He uses that intense verb, and it also implies that, just like in the garden, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. He's driven by the Spirit. Mark 1:12 says this, at once the Spirit sent him. In other words, no, you go. He drove him out into the wilderness, desert. And he was in the desert 40 days, being tempted by Satan. So he's driven by the Spirit into the desert, and he's there for 40 days alone. Days of hunger and days of temptation. See, here's the deal. The desert is the place you never want to be. You never want to go. It's the place that's not flowing with milk and honey. and great jobs and Hawaii-like weather. It's a dry, it's a barren place. And what's really worse about this is you don't know how long you're going to be there. Biblically speaking, how long is 40? I don't know exactly. And people who are in it say, are we there yet? People sometimes, even church people, they try to ignore the reality of the detours of life. But it will come. And when your heart aches with hurt or loss, and you don't know why, when you long for, say, a really good thing, and maybe you have faith and it seems like God could just give you that good thing if he wanted to, but he doesn't. You see it and you know it's good. This is good. It's not selfish. It's good. But God's leading me in the opposite direction. I've noticed in my life, sometimes the desert is often triggered by some event, right? Maybe for some of you, a child you love runs away, or a grandchild. They run away, either figuratively or literally. And you don't know if you'll ever get that child back. Sometimes like a financial disaster. Some of you may be facing that. You lose your job. Or you get a report from the doctor. And all of a sudden your whole world has changed. And it'll never be the same. Sometimes you can have a dream, and you spend years looking forward to when that dream is going to come true. Then one day you realize not only has it not come true, it's never going to come true. And it dies. And a little part of you dies with it. We all have desert detours. And again, if you haven't, you will. And when it comes, it does not mean God has forgotten about you. It does not mean that there is no God or that you've been abandoned. God is at work even in the detours, work that we may never see and never understand. You know, God's way is rarely the quickest, rarely the easiest. But God is doing a work in a way that you could never imagine. You know, I've been in ministry long enough, when people look back on their lives, often it is those detours, it is the desert times that they say most shape them, where they have grown the most. I've never, in 38 years of ministry, started when I was 7, where you go up to somebody and say, hey, what was the time in your life where you grew the most? No one has ever said, well, it's when I spent 2 weeks in a hammock in Maui. No. Let me give you, just for a few minutes, a few observations. Detours is the place where we learn to wait, to be still. It's where we learn patience. How are you doing with that? I'm not doing very well. I want it. I want to be patient. I want to learn patience, but we all would like to have patience, but none of us want to go through the pain of having to learn it. See, every day, the Israelites would wake up, and there would be that pillar, whether it be a cloud or fire, And they had to ask, as they were still going south, the opposite direction, am I going to follow this today? We're going further and further in the wrong direction. I mean, how long is this journey going to be? Hey, Moses, are we there yet? I don't know what are we there yet? Maybe for you, you're single. And that seems to be your detour. You thought way after, before now, you would meet some significant person and start on your life, and it hasn't happened. You've waited and waited for 40 days. How long? I don't know. But I'm not there yet. Maybe you are married, but maybe your marriage has become such a huge detour experience. It's painful. You had hopes and dreams that you set on your wedding vows that just have not come true. So maybe the question for you is this: will you still follow the cloud? Will you patiently be obedient to God? Will you, by your will, love your spouse one day at a time, even when it's not easy? Will you follow his leading? Wonderful things can happen even in the detour that you never expected. Another thing is this: the detour is often the place. Thank you. That was my pacemaker. I needed the battery replaced. The detour is often the place where God makes us strong. 2 Corinthians, you see it there, but it basically says, I find strength, Paul says, in my weakness. It's the odd paradox of the kingdom of God, right? None of us want to be thought of as weak. In fact, in church and at business or wherever, we want to think of ourselves as the opposite. We're strong, we're capable, we can handle this. It's very interesting. In this story, you just asked this question, and you kind of wish you could ask the question now. In other words, it would be like this: God, why are you leading us in the wrong direction? The Israelites easily said that. Moses may have even said it. And for us, most of us, we don't know why God is putting us in this detour. But listen, this is great. In this story, we know exactly why God took them into the desert. The text actually tells us. Look at this, Exodus 13. Exodus 13, verse 17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country. That road, by the way, was the one along the coast. Though that was shorter. Why did you do that, God? For God said, if they face war, because the Philistines were a warring people, if they face war, they might change their minds and go back to Egypt. So God led the people on a detour around by the desert, right? The direct route, in other words, like Interstate 85, back then, it would take them past people, the Philistines, who were hostile. Now, I know what you're thinking. Well, couldn't God perfectly, take care of them even with that? Yes, God was perfectly capable of delivering them in any number of ways, just like he could deliver you. But they didn't really trust in God. They were too frightened. Why? They're slaves. You got to remember this. They had a slave mentality. Their father was a slave. Their grandfather was a slave. Their great-great-grandfather was a slave. Their great-great-great. They knew nothing but slavery for 400 years. So God would have to lead them on this detour so that day by day, week by week, year by year, He would develop in them these qualities of courage and faith and persistence that were just not present in them yet. You think watching the parting of the Red Sea helped their trust factor? Absolutely. You think manna coming out of the sky, out of heaven, helped them, their trust? Absolutely. Listen, I want to tell you this. God is not nearly as concerned with where His people are going as who they will be when they get there. And the same is true for you and me. See, for 400 years, they had been slaves. And all of that mentality, all of that stuff, think of it, was still inside them. They never had to think. They never had to weigh something out. They never had to make a plan or trust. They had masters that did all of that for them. All they had to do is make sure they show up at the job site. There's an old sermon observation. I don't know who first said it. I know it wasn't me. But it says this: it took one night to get Israel out of Egypt, but it took 40 years to get Egypt out of Israel. See, I want to tell you again, it's never hard to trust in the land of milk and honey. When everything is working out okay, when your prayers are getting answered as soon as you say them. All your problems go away. Your kids, their teeth, they straighten by themselves. When your 401k is up and your weight is down. It's easy to trust in those days. But what about the detour in the desert? Where there's no milk, no honey, just put in that place things that you want, things that you enjoy, things that you like. When you have no idea where God is leading you, can you still trust Him? Can you still trust God when the cloud seems to be going at the wrong direction? See, I want to say you have no idea in your detour what evil God may be keeping from you. We all have our Philistines. See, I think it's really at those times that obedience simply comes from the will. Doesn't come from how we feel, doesn't come from after we left a worship thing. It just comes just from our will, where we just say, God, no matter how long the detour goes, I will follow you. I will trust you. I will obey you. I will stay the course. If it means 40 days, 40 weeks, 40 months, or 40 years. Even if it's the rest of my life, God, I will follow you and I will not compromise my integrity or my character. See, you compromise your integrity. You compromise your character as a Christian when you decide to go your own direction. God grows really strong people in the unexpected detours. Here's the last thing. The detours is also where I come face to face with who I am, with my own stuff, with my own temptations, with my own sins. See, in the Bible, very often, it happens in the desert. The desert The detour in the desert reveals, because it's a tough time, who we really are, not what we project. So then the question becomes this: will I be willing to look at that truth, as painful as it is, at myself, at my temptations, my shadow side, right? We all have a shadow side. We all have that dark side of the moon that no one sees. So I don't know what the desert reveals about you. I do know it's very painful. And our first inclination is to run. So the question is, are you going to keep running, or will you embrace the truth? You know, the detour in that desert is the place where, the ordinary gratifications, the things that often work in our lives to keep us from seeing deeply into our lives, are things that I imagine I try to construct, my reputation, my achievements, the people I want to impress. All of a sudden that is taken away. The detour in my life, I just get reduced to the basics, where nothing is no longer available to distract me. Now I have to choose. Will I face the truth about me, or will I continue to live in denial, live in the mask? See, I can hide, or I can come out of hiding and be healed. But I can't do both. So I hope you don't hide. Those of you who are in that desert right now, that detour, don't hide. I hope you get real with God. I hope you get real with yourself. And I hope you get real with another person. That's why we exist as a church. I know we all look good here. If you're a visitor, you're probably looking around thinking, man, everybody looks so good. We all look like we got it together. And I know why you would think that, but that's not true. All of us, we're in a sort of a remedial group that follow Jesus. We all need help, constant help. All of us, we're still on a journey, and I got to tell you, we haven't arrived. And sometimes for all of us, it's frustrating, and we sometimes say, God, am I still struggling with that? I mean, here I am, a Christian for 100 years, and I'm still struggling with this. And our hearts sing, and our spirit groans, and we say these words. Are we there yet? Is our church there yet? No. We're all on a journey. Several years ago, Ruth Bell Graham, wife of Billy Graham, passed away. Ruth was keenly aware because of who she was, married to Billy. And so everybody lifts them up, just like they do the pastor. I've been here long enough that you guys have given up. But she was so aware of the fact that she hadn't arrived. She wasn't what people thought she was. And she was driving down a road in North Carolina, and she saw another road sign, and it stuck in her mind. It didn't say Detour. But it did answer the question, are we there yet? And one day, she died. And finally, that question was answered. Finally, eternally answered. Yes, you're there. And this is what she put on her gravestone. At the bottom, if you can't see it, I'll read it. It says, she picked this up from the roadside, end of construction. Thank you for your patience. Isn't that great? You ever drove down a road and, and then it, bottlenecks because they're fixing a bridge or something, and you're in traffic forever, and you think, goodness gracious. And then you finally get to the bridge, and you think, oh, I see the end. And then on the other side, it opens back up. And then some states that are nice, like North Carolina, South Carolina, they say things like this: end of construction. Thank you for your patience. In New Jersey, just, hey, forget about it. It's a rude state. All right, listen. When you're in a desert, and you will be in a desert, don't give up. And you know what the Israelites kind of found out? Really, they did, if you look at their history, that life is not about milk and honey. It's not even about the land. Put it in your life or my life. It's not about the job. It's not about even your marriage. It's not about the house. It's not about the money. You're on a detour, but the great thing about it is you're on the detour with one who created you, who knows you better than anyone. And his love for you is so deep. See, I think a lot of us need to learn what the Israelites learned, because they never trusted God. They had a slave mentality. Paul tells one church in the Bible, New Testament, he says, you're not a slave again. You're a son. You're a daughter. Do you believe that? It's in the desert. Listen, in the desert, oddly enough, that we find the only hope worth having. And that hope is Jesus. Think about Jesus. Jesus did not take the shortest route to the throne of power. He didn't take I-80. He took the detour through the desert. Remember, he's God, but he humbled himself to become obedient, taking on the form of a slave, washing feet. And his final walk to his death was from the temple to the cross. And there was this winding road, a road that I have been on. It's called the road of great suffering, the road of great hostility, carrying a cross on his back, and a mob ridiculing him the whole way. A walk that his followers would later call the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, the way of suffering. That's our God. Jesus says to you, there's going to be an end of construction. One day, the triumph of the resurrection and glory and hope and life is going to be yours. We say at the end of the service, now unto him who's able to keep you from falling, but will one day present you faultless. Are we there yet? No, not yet. But one day. Be patient. It's coming. Let's pray. Father, I pray particularly for everybody here whose hearts ache, who knows sorrow and grief and confusion and disappointment. I pray for everybody who is right now on a long detour, a detour of what they thought life would be, a detour of what they thought their marriage would be, a detour with their health or their children, maybe even their faith. I pray they will meet Jesus on the road. And we ask this together in Jesus' name. Amen.